Hey, I'm Austin, and I've been playing around recently with the Zero Sync framework that's in alpha from Rocicorp, and having a lot of fun with it. So I figured I would do a little walkthrough of getting up and running using Zero Sync and NextJS. Okay, so I have a basic application. I just use create next app just to get that scaffolded and up and running. And now I'm going to go ahead and add in Zero. So this is Zero. It is a local first sync engine. It's by the same people who created Replicache, if you've ever seen or used that. Um, it's pretty simple to work with. You can plug it into React really easily. Um, it gives you nice hooks to work with, and you're basically just using sort of an ORM, but it's backed by local first data structures, so it'll store it either in memory or in IndexedDB in the client's browser, and then sync with your backend database, which currently they're only supporting Postgres, but I think they have plans to add more in the future. So pretty easy to use, and I'll show you how to get started. So we're going to need Next.js, which we have set up. Then we're going to need our Postgres database and a Zero Sync server. So they have a few examples here of how to get started, including ZBugs, which is actually their bug tracker that they actually use. That's fun, built with Zero. They also have a React quick start, uses Vite and a solid version, and then another React version that uses Cloudflare durable objects. But we're just going to use React rather than going from a quick start, just Next.js and add in Zero from there. Okay, so I made a few changes. I added Zero as a dependency. I also, just something to keep in mind, made sure that in the package.json the type is set to module. That's important for running the Zero cache, since this is using TSX, and we'll try to import that TS file and we'll throw an error if it's not set to module. I also split out our dev command for running the three components locally. So next dev is Next.js dev server. That's going to be dev UI. Dev cache is going to be the Zero cache dev server. And I'm pointing that at the path to the schema file, which we'll come to next. And then dev DB is running our Postgres database via Docker. So over here we have our Docker compose file. This is based on one of the ones in the Hello Zero quick start guide. I just stripped out a few things. But the main thing we'll have to keep in mind is environment variables we need to set for username and password, the port, as well as down here is the seed data, which we'll come to next. And then also a volume that we'll need to delete when we're cleaning up. This just allows it to persist. So if we shut down the Docker container, any data that we added or updated will stay and won't be deleted until we tell it to. So now over here, I added that seed data directory and a seed SQL file. Docker Compose will start up that Postgres database, and once it loads for the first time, it will run all these SQL files in the seed data directory. This is just going to set up a few databases, ones that Zero will need. This is the main one where we're going to put our schema. The other ones it uses, and as far as I've seen, we don't really have to deal with for now. So I created a type for a user and a task. So our test application is just going to be a task list with multiple users. I added 2 users and then just a couple of tasks to get us started. Now over here in our schema.ts file, you can see pretty similar, looks like a lot of other ORMs for getting started and defining the shape of the data. We have our user table, our task table, the columns in there, primary keys, and then we're also defining relationships between those. So you'll be able to get the created by user from the task and the assigned to user from the task. And that'll help us out down the line a little bit. Last thing is defining the schema. So this will come in handy later when we're querying. Some types that we can reuse. And then the last thing is this permissions object. For now, I left it empty, but this is going to allow us to put some granular permissions on reading, writing, updating, and those CRUD operations around the data in our schema. But for now, I'm leaving it open because it's going to allow us to get up and running quickly and not have to worry about that. Okay, last part here before we get up and running is I created an env file. This is going to have our credentials and secrets for connecting to Zero and for Zero to connect to the database. So a few key things. These are the databases that, if you remember, we created in our seed.sql file. Auth secret, we don't need this for now, but we will later if we add permissions. This is a local replica file that Zero will store information in when it's running its local dev server. And then the last thing is this is the address of the local dev server. So in production, this would be something different, but for now, this is just going to be that dev cache command. Okay, so now I have a few different terminals ready to get running. For each of our dev commands, we have our database, we have the cache, and we have NextJS with our dev UI. So I'm going to run each of those. Let's do the database first. Great. And the cache. Great. You can see it created our zero.schema file based on the schema TypeScript file we created. We don't need to do anything with that for now, but just so you know it's there. And NextJS, this shouldn't really do much since we haven't connected it to Zero yet, but now we have it up and running. Okay, so now I'm adding in a Zero provider component. This is going to wrap the Zero exported provider component and add in our Zero client. I'm hard coding a few values here just for the sake of speed and simplicity. User ID, we can always come back to that later. Auth, I'm hiding that. We didn't set anything with permissions, so we don't need that right now. I'm adding in our server, passing in the schema that we're importing from our schema file. And for the KV store, we're using in-memory. Down the road, we could switch that to IDB, meaning IndexedDB, and that'll speed things up on the client side. But now, during development, they recommend using in-memory, because otherwise you're going to have to go in and clear that out as you make changes, and we don't need that. And then one more thing we're doing here is bringing in the use0 hook. So we'll use this a lot in our components, but we're just going to re-export that with our type, schema type passed in, just as a little convenience for us. And then last thing to remember here is we want to make this a client component. Okay, now I've imported it and I'm putting it in our root layout. We can come back and be a little more granular about where we want to actually put that. But just for the sake of simplicity, again, let's put it in our root layout. So everything from here on underneath that will have access to it. Okay, now just to test things out and make sure we have everything connected up, making sure the data is in our database, and make sure things are working correctly, I'm just going to run a simple query. We're going to make a task list component, just going to list out our tasks. But first, I'm just going to print out everything we have and see what that looks like. So I'm actually going to make a little tweak here. Instead of putting the Zero provider in the root layout, I added a route group called app, and I added a layout, and I'm going to make that the place where we put the Zero provider. Just going to fix a few issues around rendering on the server side. So as you can see here, it's just a little quick couple hooks to check if it's on the client or on the server. If it's on the server side, it's just going to put up a loading component, and then otherwise, if it's on the client, it's going to render the Zero provider and everything under that. Okay, so I've added a couple pages here. A tasks page, so this has our tasks list, and that's where we are now. I also added a few nav links, one to take us to our tasks page and one to take us to our users page. So then there's also the users page that has a list of users, and then I added some placeholders here for specific individual task or user detail pages. Just getting the params out, but we will come back to that. I added a few columns, so one for each of the possible states, not started, in progress, or done, and each one gets its own zero client and performs a query. Now you can see an example of adding a filter. So before we just had z.query.task, now we're adding that .where, and the syntax is sort of like, possibly other ORMs you might have used. The column you're querying, an operator or a comparison operator, and then the value that you're matching against. And it's still going to return an array of those task items. And then I'm adding the title in here and creating these task cards. So in this case, I was a little hacky in how I did this, and we can come back to this, but so here I'm filling in, passed in the task from the column component above, and I'm filling that in. We're showing the name of the task, who created it with a link to that person, where Bob is user 2, Alice is user 1, and this all reloads as we go. But I'm getting those names by querying again with the zero client inside the task card. We can come back to that with a better way, but here's another example, just FYI. If we just want one thing back, we're using the where filter and then the one method to just return one item from that query. And I'm doing that both for the user table and getting the creator and the assignee. Then a couple buttons here, and we're adding some mutations. So I added a left arrow and a right arrow if you need to move from one to the next, and a delete button. So I haven't filled in delete yet, but I'll do that. Here you can see if I hit the right arrow, it's going to move the movie tickets over. We can reload that and it persists. Move it back, move this over, move that back. So there we go. Now the last piece of the puzzle for this page is I'm going to add the delete button. So this is going to, like those update mutators, this is going to delete a record, and this is the filter of which to delete with the ID of task ID. So we can see that working here. I'm going to delete get milk. Now it's gone. We can reload it, still gone. Okay, I made one more tweak going back to what we were talking about before. Rather than requerying in each of the task cards, I'm pulling in that relationship to the assignee and the creator for each task. So I updated the query from z.query.task and then the where to now adding in these related fields, which, if you remember in the schema, we define those task relationships. So now we can call those here, and you can see those are the suggested relationships, and it returns this type. So now I'm passing in created by and assigned to down here and replacing those queries there. I still need the zero client in this case to make the mutations in each case, for each of these buttons, but we're able to get rid of the duplicate queries using those relationships. Okay, so I've made a few more tweaks. I added a new task link that's going to take us to a new task page. So let's test that out. Oops, accidentally created an empty task. But here's the input. Let's say remove the empty task. Create. And now you can see over in this other window, remove the empty task was created, and so was the empty task. So let's go back to tasks. And in addition to that, I also added an edit tasks component. But let's first look at the create tasks just to see what that looks like. It's just an input. In this case, I'm using use state just because, again, this is rough, but I figured new task is sort of ephemeral state that doesn't necessarily need to be committed to the database, but maybe there's an argument against that maybe you would want to keep that, and then we could figure out some place to put that or something along those lines. But for now, that's just going to be in a use state until you hit the create button. Then it's going to add it to the database with this mutation. Easy enough, just a few lines of code. Now let's look at edit task. So ID is a little less clean because I was using nano ID for that. But here is the text of the task, status, who created it, who assigned the task. And remember, I'm signed in as Alice here. So now keep an eye on the other screen over here and watch as I make changes. Remove the empty task. So the handy thing here is it's updating it as we go. You can see I can make changes to these, and it's going to change what column it's in. I can change who it's assigned to, who it's created. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but in this case, we could change who created it. But look at that, super easy. It's updating real time across across tabs. Pretty cool. Now let's go back into tasks here, and I'm going to delete that empty one. And it's gone. Reload it. These keep coming back. Remove the empty tasks. Say it was in progress. Let's put it in done. Great, we did it. So I think that's pretty much everything you need to get started quickly with NextJS and Zero Sync. It's a lot of fun to work with. It's pretty easy. It has pretty much everything you need to really get your application up and running and do everything you would do with a traditional backend, but it allows you to work in the front end. Sometimes it just takes a little thinking about how things might be different. Like in the case of the form updating state, you might have to think about what if you have two people in that form at the same time. But it's not something you wouldn't have to think about in other cases. Say you had two people editing separate forms and they submitted them without, seeing the other person's change first, and you'd have those same conflicts. You're just seeing them a little sooner here. So there are ways to handle that, but this is just a local first approach. So anyway, that aside, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll come back and get into permissions and deployment.